Okay, so welcome everyone to this book launch and seminar. We've got some great speakers. Hopefully everyone gets something out of this. I think before we started, Janice wanted to say a few words.
Okay, well, as we come together, let's try and make this a sacred space. Probably you're in the middle of getting supper and all sorts of things. So maybe pause for just one moment. Remember the wonderful world we're in, the God who is within us all. And share this moment of just being together in half a minute's silence. May our time together be blessed. Thank you. Okay, back to you, Michael. Take care.
Thank you very much. So just to quickly go over what we're going to go over today. So I'll start off by doing a little bit of an introduction to the idea of the universal story in writing and in publishing. Then we're going to go over the contents of the book with Heather Jane. And then Janice Dolley is going to look at a new story for our time. And then we're going to go back to Heather Jane and look at the value of our story, specifically within, I think, biographies. And then moving on to Diarmuid towards universal spirituality in the 21st century. And then if anyone has any questions, please, if you can reserve them for towards the end, because then we can have a Q&A session at the end. And we're hoping should be finished by 8:30. So I'll check if there's any last few people. No, that needs to be everyone. So to start off with, I'm going to take you a little bit on the journey. And like all journeys, I'm sure there'll be some confusing bits, but hopefully you'll get something out of it by the end. So the idea of the universal story, particularly in creative writing and art and publishing, is based on the understanding that patterns of meaning exist everywhere. And I think a lot of us understand this because we can see, we can see cycles in nature. We can see, the moon, the planet itself, the life and death of plants, of animals. So we can see that these cycles exist in continuous motion. And this kind of suggests some kind of intelligence and design. And because of this, also, because we're part of nature as well, these patterns exist within us and our psyche. And I really like Carl Jung's idea, I don't know if anyone is familiar, but his understanding of a collective unconscious, this kind of seeing of a deep collective kind of reservoir of meaning that exists in each of us and we're able to connect with. And so our own journeys kind of follow similar universal patterns. So this leads to the universal story in us. And if you ever heard of Joseph Campbell, he looked at all the mythologies and all the religions from the past, and he was able to understand that there was an underlying structure. So just as the cycles in nature, for example, the life and death of a plant, just as there's meaning outside, there's also meaning inside. And there's like kind of a connecting thread of meaning between these things. So these kind of archetypal journeys are an exploration of our personal growth, and we can see this, for example, in different religions, in different mythologies, and even today in some of the, the movies today, for example, some of the superhero movies, if people are into that, or even Star Wars, or even most stories, there's an underlying structure that shows personal growth and spiritual growth. And this suggests that we're all kind of connected to some kind of source of wisdom and truth, that isn't just imaginary, there is something underlying there. So one of my favorite patterns, basically, to use is the hero's journey. And it kind of follows 12 steps. And this is what Joseph Campbell extrapolated out of his research into mythologies and different religions. And it shows the pattern that each story takes, or the hero in each story, or the protagonist, takes in order to come back from their journey. And usually they come back to the same place that they started off with. And I won't go into too much detail in relation to each of these steps, because it's more about understanding that there is a deeper meaning underlying all these stories, connecting them all together across different cultures. But some of the important things is this idea of death and rebirth, and the fact that you gain something through this process of growth. Also, very important is, as you see, the very first step is the ordinary world, and this is our place of comfort and of the known. And we see this today as through our modern world, but it can be one of order, but that is stagnant, or it can also be one of chaos, in which a new order needs to be found. And usually this is found through the second step, which is the call of adventure. And this usually suggests some kind of outside force. And I'm sure everyone in their own lives can think of something, whether it's spiritual or psychological, or emotional. They found them often stuck in where they are in their lives. There's always something from the outside that allows almost like a door opening for their own personal journey. And usually this then takes a step of a refusal of the journey before actually a progression through each of these steps. And then some kind of reward, whether spiritual and understanding, before then returning and being able to share that reward with the community. So how does this relate nowadays to our understanding of meaning? Well, as we move from kind of religious doctrine and kind of spiritual tradition, more towards science, and even science as a belief system, and our understanding of materialism, we have these three progressive movements of ideology. And we have, so I don't know if everyone's familiar with, but we have a movement from nihilism, existentialism, which is hugely, has a huge impact today, towards postmodernism. And why this is important is because basically, as we moved from away from believing these external truths, I don't know if most people are familiar with the quote, "God is dead" by Nietzsche, but just understanding that suddenly the world it has no more meaning, that the universe is random, and that apart from being kind of materialistic in a physical realm with just our brains, our bodies, the universe is empty, basically. It's completely empty, it's bereft of meaning, and there's nothing there apart from what we give it. And so this is where it moved from nihilism to existentialism, because obviously that's slightly more positive, because existentialism is basically understanding that there is no meaning out there, but that we might as well create some for ourselves. We might as well create some kind of imaginary purpose to be able to exist in life. And because of this, and because of the understanding that actually all there is just the material world, this has led to just ideologies that were given by society based on the American dream, on success, on getting money, on getting pleasure, basically the idea that anything, even if slightly spiritual, was just imaginary. And this even led to kind of a further fragmentation of meaning with postmodernism, where even meaning itself is circular and further fragmented, and there is no universal truth based. And postmodernism is very popular today in universities. Existentialism is essentially what is being promoted through our whole educational system. And so moving from what I was looking at, where we have a deep connection to meaning and patterns in our mythologies and our religion, to suddenly moving to understanding that the universe is empty of this meaning, has a huge impact on people and their lives. And suddenly people are looking outside of themselves, and they feel isolated, they feel disconnected from family units, and there is no real value system, and there is no real meaning that they can find in society, because this society is based on the understanding that there is no real meaning outside, that you just have to make up something for yourself. And I posit that actually it's the opposite. Life is full of meaning. And I think anyone that really sits down and thinks about it can see this. The universe is full of universal truths, and we can see this in our stories. There's an underlying meaning that connects all civilizations and all stories. There is a collective unconscious full of ideas and archetypes. And we can see these, when we look at children, we don't have to teach them some of these ideas, such as beauty and goodness and justice. They come into this world already with our understanding. And it might not be fully developed. They might not be able to articulate it fully, but it's not something they have to learn. If anything, it's something they have to remember. It's something that they have to connect with, which shows that there is meaning in the universe. The universe is full of meaning. And that's why we can all recognize sunsets as beautiful. We don't have to be told that a sunset is beautiful. We don't have to learn that. We can just see it and understand. And this is the understanding that with these patterns and what a story really is, a story is just a connection of different meanings, of different ideas, much like a song, and much like, as Pythagoras would see, the divine harmony of the universe. I mean, he was a mathematician, but he was also a musician, and he had a deep understanding of the harmony of notes and how it plays a more holistic approach to our own lives, even to healing and things like that. And so it's trying to move back towards this understanding that there is truth and meaning, and why we've kind of moved away from that. And so it brings us back to the universal story in publishing and creativity, because I see therefore that art is almost a divine science to some degree. It's a divine exploration, because it's able to express some of these universal truths present in each of us, and also allow people to connect with their own universal truths and their own journeys, and to see their own life as a song in which they wish to harmonize each note. And so as an audience, a book can be a mirror to understanding something within themselves. And this is why I think publishing is so important, allowing each person and each author not focusing on marketing goals, which is a lot of what the industry does today, but focusing more on this understanding of the value of meaning, and allowing each author to be able to express that more fully. And so that then leads on to some of the following conversations this evening, which is we need a new story for our time. We need to be able to connect again with these underlying meanings and values. We need to find again what we had from the past. And we need to be able to reimagine our creative industries to be able to better express this and follow this. So I hope that makes sense. Hope you got something out of that. And I didn't go into much detail into each element because I obviously haven't got much time, and I just wanted to give an overview as to why meaning in stories is so important. And stories is not just about what happens one moment after another in a character's life. It's a connection of archetypes. And I didn't go much into kind of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, but this is something we can always explore at a further date, or if people have questions about that. I think now Heather Jane is gonna do an introduction to the book. Do you need to share your screen for this?
I just need to share, yes, one of my slides, if possible. So yes, if you could make me host. And I will try to share my screen. And here it is. And I think I can make it a bit bigger, except that there's a bar over the icon that I need to make it a little bit bigger. But I think we'll be able to see. Let's see if there's somewhere else I can. Okay. So just at this point, we thought we'd introduce you to some of the themes and the content of the book. And I've actually slightly cribbed here from somebody who is actually on this call today, because she very kindly wrote a very generous review of the book, and it is a good way of leading us through what's in the book. And she started with this lovely quotation. Sorry, I'm quoting her lovely writing, where she said, "This is a gift of a book for these times. I found it to be sober, calming, rooted, respectful, and underpinned by contemporary voices from a range of professional and theological sources." And really connecting with what Mikhail has just said, reading the book, you do see a pattern and a journey that each biographer has taken. And there definitely is a pattern of death and resurrection, and people coming back with an elixir. And that is manifest in many different ways. but there's a great desire from people to share this in whatever way is appropriate to them. So anyway, we start the book trying to look at what is going on in the world. And we did write this bit probably before the war in Ukraine, certainly before the war in Gaza, or at least the latest iteration of the conflict that's been going on there. But we looked at what's going on tried to analyze what's going on in the world and this landscape of change that is challenging us all and currently leading us all to despair, or many of us to despair, and many to a sense of hopelessness, and beginning to look at how we can address those things as individuals and collectively. Then the second part is really the heart of the book for me, and it was the reason why I wanted to do this book, which was to share people's stories, because one of the things that I've become really aware of is the wisdom that lies in each soul. And I've certainly been to schools where young pupils in some of the most deprived schools have been given the chance to actually explore what's inside them. And there's a stunning wisdom in them that isn't often seen in the system of education that we have. They don't always have that opportunity to actually bring forth what's in them. So I was aware, of course, of this and of the wisdom in just ordinary people. And many of the people that were our biographers were people that had perhaps challenged some of what they were hearing in church. Some had left, and often those people would have been regarded as backslidden or kind of not faithful in some ways. But actually, these are stories of people who were deeply faithful to an inner call and to exploring much more widely. So it was wonderful to have been able to bring their voices out into a wider context so that people could hear the wisdom of ordinary people on a hero's journey, no less. And then we do try to, based on the stories and the kinds of themes that were coming up in the stories, in part 3, we then try to introduce some of those ideas, explore some of those ideas a little bit. There was so much that came out that this is inevitably a bit of a skimming over the surface, and we were aware of that, but we felt it was good to introduce people to these themes and leave people to research them more fully if they resonated with them. And then we finish really with looking at the future that's emerging and what a spirituality which can address the needs of our time needs to encompass. Linda kindly says that we don't shy away from the challenges and tasks faced by faith communities and people of faith, but rather open pathways and possibilities that require us to listen and move from a place of love. And this last section does look at both Christianity, but what's happening in the wider contemporary field of spirituality and how they can come together or not as the future emerges. So that's really a very brief introduction to what's in the book. I'll stop.
Well, thank you, Heather Jane. Shall I carry on from there?
Do, please.
Thank you. Well, I think Heather Jane has given us a nice sense of how individuals are responding to the new story that's emerging. And so I think what I'm going to do is look at some of the changes that are going on that form the backcloth to this, because whatever change is happening in the universe and in the world is obviously going to bring forth change within us. So I'm just going to run through about key 12 key shifts that I think are going on, and some will make sense to you and some may not, but these somehow underline many of the stories that are coming up through individuals. So I think the first one I wanted to speak about was that we're in a great astrological shift. I know astrology can be a difficult subject for some people, but Jesus was born at the start of the Piscean era, and that lasted for 2,100 years, and we're just transitioning now into the Aquarian era, which is a big shift because it's involving us moving from something which is a bit more fixed. That was an era of set beliefs and set ways of doing things, to something that's much more fluid, which sort of explains why there's a lot of coming together of people. The fluidity is bringing us greater synergy. And so you've got interfaith movements, interspirituality movements. There's a greater learning from others going on than perhaps there once used to be. And this has to be also reflected and enjoyed by hearing what other people are learning. Before lockdowns, we used to be able to get together and share. Now, of course, we're really very much more reliant on this sort of session, but it's all very educative for us to hear how it is for others. So I think if I were to summarize this, it's a time of awakening to a new awareness of the oneness of all life. For me, this happened 50 years ago in a sort of peak experience where I really saw into how the one divine energy flows through absolutely everything, even through a wasp. And I'd never liked wasps, but since that moment, I've never actually spotted one or killed anything consciously. So that life is actually one. And I think poets and mystics have often seen this well before it's become there for the rest of us. In the 18th century, Alexander Pope wrote, "The world is one stupendous whole, whose body nature is, and God the soul." And then even earlier, 12th century, the mystic Hildegard of Bingen was singing lovely songs, praising the divine oneness and beauty of all life. So it's nothing new, it's been coming through the ages, but right now it's springing forth into much wider understanding and underpinning, so that we're beginning to develop a new paradigm, really, a new narrative of who we are and why we're here. Mikhail, our lovely publisher, was talking about how these different shifts have happened in there being no meaning in life and now being real meaning. And I think the stories you'll find in this book really show that for each individual there is real meaning. So this sense of the oneness is giving us a greater sense of interdependence. We're realizing that everything is deeply connected, and therefore my neighbor and myself are really part of one family. And so therefore we do need to love one another, as we were told. So the next sort of shift that I wanted to look at was that what is underlying all these different things, which is why, coming from a Christian background, as many of us do, we do know that the world was created in love and is sustained in love. And its love is the link that helps us to share in this way. So the Beatles song that came bursting in the 1960s, "All You Need Is Love," really was perhaps almost a trigger for the era we're moving into now. So love is the way. As this moves us more to heart-centered ways of being and living. In the era we're leaving behind, it was a big focus on beliefs, on the head, on mental ideas. creeds, doctrines, things we believed in. That's kind of shifting because science is moving us in a new direction, as I hope we'll hear a bit about later. And the heart is now coming as the center of who we really are. And I have read somewhere that there's as much intelligence in our heart as in our brains, actually, which is quite a nice thought. So within each atom is this love, if we can see it. And just this week, I was listening online to two women talking about how they have learnt to communicate with all aspects of nature, with trees, with animals, with plants, even some of them are communicating with insects. And a little while ago, I heard an Australian woman talk about the way she has learnt to connect with water and ask it questions and get a response. So life is opening up in so many ways. And one of these ways, I think, is a greater withinness. So instead of the head being what's leading us, our hearts and the withinness is becoming more important. And this also shines through these stories, I think. And this innerness really is giving us access to another dimension of being. Our daily lives are very stuck in the third dimension, things you can touch and feel and make and cook. But there's an inner one when we can, for Christians, when we pray, when we meditate, we're connecting with a fourth or inner dimension. And I best learned to understand this by realizing that actually all is energy. The whole universe is made of energy vibrating in different frequencies. In lower frequencies, it comes through as matter, as material things. In a fourth, that's the third dimension. In a fourth dimension, the innerness. And then people are exploring the fifth dimension, which is where you are part of one greater whole. And so this awareness of the great whole is bringing more compassion for everything. We're realizing that if this plant is actually also revealing the divine, then we treat it with love and care. And this is sort of newly coming to me anyway, in a fairly recent way. So this brings me a bit to the sense of the two aspects of Christianity. There's been the exoteric outer stream, which is the beliefs, the set ideas, which really started and were laid down from about the 4th century onward. But within that mainstream orthodoxy, there's been an inner esoteric stream, which has come through the ages, and which some people tuned into early on, and in the early centuries realized that the people who wanted to control the church would do away with it, and so much was buried in earthen jars. And you probably all know of anyway, the Nag Hammadi Gospels, which were found in an earthen jar in 1945. And they have a lovely set of esoteric beliefs, which really give us a deeper meaning to everything that we have learnt in Bible study or in other forms of reading. So we've got these two streams flowing through. And I found when I read all the stories in the book, it was this tapping into a sort of inner or esoteric stream, which has really meant something to people and given them a sense of the universality that's emerging at the moment. And we are truly becoming sort of one world. Another aspect of the stories is that people are writing about their direct experience. So you may tell me something is true, but really I've got to experience it for myself and find it really ringing bells within me. Because we have to live authentically. I think authenticity is important. And so things have to ring true with us now. And the authenticity of these stories really is so clear, is so clear. And the sense that we share what other people have experienced, we have a commonality. And maybe this is because consciousness is running through everything in life. Dr. Jude Caravan, who has written quite a seminal book and is getting quite well known globally, her book was called The Cosmic Hologram. But in that, she makes this statement, and this really does ring bells with me. Consciousness is not something that we have. It is what we and the whole world are. So all is consciousness of a different sort, which again is another window on what I've been saying maybe, and is part of what's emerging more widely as what we are calling the new story. Interestingly, I have been very involved with the Findhorn Foundation, which was founded on listening to the inner voice, the voice of God within. The three founders, well, the two female founders anyway, and then the third, who was the husband of one, Peter Caddy, married to Eileen Caddy, followed what it was they were suggesting was being given to them. So a whole vast community was developed on the basis of inner listening. And just at lunchtime today, I was actually interviewed on the telephone by someone running a research project, King's University, King's College in London, and what she was exploring was listening to inner voices. Our interview lasted well over an hour. It was quite interesting. It was really interesting. So this also is coming to the fore, that there is an innerness in life. This has been affirmed very much by those people who have experienced a near-death experience. Just a few days ago, I was with a Colombian lady who had 3 near-death experiences. Her first when she was only 3 years old, followed by 2 more. And she described them and sort of talked about this realm that she found herself in, where all was love, and she was just surrounded by beings of light, she called them. So this is another route to affirming the growing sense that there is other dimensions, other beings, whether we call them angelic or whether we call them extraterrestrials. There is much more to life than we used to believe. My own interest particularly is in what's being called after-death communication, where it's possible to converse with those who've passed over. I have myself written a book with my best friend, Ursula Burton, which started 3 hours after she died. And that was our first conversation. And then we had many more whenever I could get away from work and have time to sort of be with her. And Sleepy Lion have published that one. It's called Awakening to New Awareness, Conscious Conversations Across the Horizon of Death. And quite recently, the Scientific and Medical Network, if you know of that very interesting network, had a session based on after-death communication. So this is actually becoming a subject of academic research, which shows it's sort of arrived as viable in some way. So I think I'd like to sort of end with coming back to understanding the teachings of Jesus the Christ more deeply once we have a sense of this changing background, so that things like the kingdom of heaven is within you used to be just an idea that I sort of thought was an idea. Now I really see what it means. It does mean that the essence of life is flowing through all of us all the time. And the instructions to love our neighbour as ourselves make complete sense once we again realize this deep interconnectedness. So that's perhaps given a bit of a sense of some of the background from which the biographers in their stories have found their own experience to ring true for them. And I hope that perhaps as a conclusion, we could come back to our role at the present time. The world is desperate for spiritual awareness, for a spiritual dimension to be restored as a normal part of life. And I hope that all of us on this call and everyone you know could be part of helping that. And I really applaud the efforts of Sleepy Lion to publish books that help this. And our job maybe is to communicate them as widely as we can. So thank you. I think that's enough from me, but maybe you can ask questions when we come to the end. Thanks a lot. Okay. So I think I'm now handing back to Heather Jane, who's going to look at the significance of the stories. Heather Jane.
Oh, thank you, Janice, for that. When you were speaking, I was thinking of a book I came across some years ago. I think it was called Landscape and Inscape, or Inscape and Landscape. And it's about the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. And he very much explores the inner, but it's also very much linked with the landscape and how connecting with the landscape, with nature around us, helps us to explore the inner. And that is one of the themes that really, I think, comes out through the biographies. And I was also put in mind of the word incarnation or incarnational, because at one time, the incarnation, and perhaps for many people, it is still located in one person in history. But I think increasingly, as this consciousness that perhaps the world, the universe, the cosmos is one whole consciousness, that everything the whole created world is in fact incarnational of that consciousness. Perhaps Diarmuid will have something to say about that later, I don't know. But those are the thoughts that ran through my mind as you were speaking, so thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can share my PowerPoint again and hope it works. Just got to bring the screen forward, share screen. Okay. Okay, so I think something that really became very clear through the biographies was how people's faith was evolving. It wasn't something that was static. And I think that is the aspect that some people have struggled with, or some people that want a very set faith find it very difficult to find that people's beliefs are changing. And it can feel quite threatening. It can feel threatening to people when they actually find that their faith is changing. And certainly for some people, and some of the biographers, they will talk about the fact that sometimes it was actually breakdown that actually led to a change in their beliefs. But in fact, the person who most uses that word breakdown says it was actually breakthrough. And it has led to a breakthrough to a much wider and more expansive faith. So for some people, it was these crises in life where they found that their experience of life was not matching the faith and the beliefs that was handed down to them. that led them on this journey. It was the call, the nudge of that to that hero's journey. One biographer related her shift to having received an ecclesiastical shock. And a number of people wanted to talk about ecclesiastical shocks on a previous Zoom. And others, it wasn't something that was shocking or something that was akin to breakdown. It was actually coming under new influences. It was inspiration from sources other than sources they would previously have looked to. So quite a number of people, Janice mentioned Findhorn, quite a number of the biographers had come into contact with the Findhorn community and found lots of new ideas there and kinship with people they might not have been able to meet before or feel they necessarily had anything in common with. So I think I mentioned that this journey can feel quite lonely and disorientating. And as people's beliefs are changing, they can't necessarily talk to their friends in the way they once did, particularly if their friends were coming from a particularly strict kind of faith. But gradually, as the journey went on, and as they followed those nudges and the attractors in the journey, the nudges, one biographer talks about somehow at the worst moments, a book would appear almost magically, which actually gave new light. So in this journey, which is sometimes dark, there are these moments when a new light starts to dawn. And from all of this, a new sense of knowing arises. But that knowing is not necessarily, I don't want to say it's not rational, because it sounds as it's not, it may not be rational because it's not located solely in brain activity, but it's something that arises in the heart. It's like almost an embodied knowing, something that you know with the whole of your being, with more of your being than only the head. And we're certainly not leaving the head out of this, because the head is part of our body. And so as the journey goes on, a new kind of, I hesitate to use the word certainty arises, but it is a deeply embodied knowing that gives a kind of certainty, not a certainty where you can necessarily even clearly articulate what it is that you actually believe, but it is something which becomes lived and a lived experience. And I think that's something which does come through the biographies. And I just finished this little bit with a quote by Father Richard Rohr, who many people quoted. "The Christ mystery is indeed the way, the truth, and the life. But this is not about a religion or group one can join, which is how we've traditionally heard it, or which is how we have heard it, but rather a mystery of incarnation that can be experienced by all and in a million different ways." And this is the way we found people were really being opened up to, this million different ways of experiencing the divine or the deeper meaning and those deeper patterns that Mikhail was talking about earlier. So I'll just go on to the next. So I just wanted to say something about the value of our spiritual biographies, because it may be something that somebody that's on the call might like to try to engage in themselves. So I've started this with a quote from Ibn Arabi, a Sufi mystic, who says that each of us reflects a name of God. And I think that's part of the value, that actually each of us, if you have this belief that we're in one consciousness, and that could by some be named God, many people are using other names like the ground of all being, or the source of all, the creative, or the vivifying force in all life. But each of us reflects that in some way. And from Rowan Williams, it's only when the vague, drifting muddle of the way we usually think about ourselves is blown away by the spirit that we see the underlying contours, the deep needs, the ingrained resistances, the aching hopes, and love. And I think as we write about our stories, the pattern, if you like, of that has been in our lives begins to emerge, and we gain a new clarity about our own journey. And when we are more clear about ourselves, we're able to share more deeply with others, and we're actually able to engage in the world in new ways because we've seen who we are, we've understood more of our own identity. I've mentioned Dana Green here. She's a biographer. She's written several biographies of mainly Christian people. And she talks about biography as being a theological pursuit. And I think it's for these it's for this very reason that as we write our own stories, we're actually in a way doing theology, because we're all part of that bigger consciousness. Another value is that actually it's really helpful to others. And in all the reviews and the comments we've had so far about the book, people have been so moved and touched by the biographies. And actually reading other people's stories lends to one's own sense of meaning in life. And I think that's a really valuable thing for people to experience. I was looking through some of them again today. I've looked through them endlessly, and I never fail to be moved by people's stories and by the wisdom in them, and being inspired by them. So that's one of the values, the value to other people as well as to ourselves. And then some of the biographies mentioned that it's a life-changing thing to actually be writing about one's own story. And we're not really talking about navel gazing here. We're talking about writing the story for a purpose. So the purpose in these stories was really for people to look at how their faith had changed. So it wasn't a narcissistic thing. It was actually with a special purpose. Another reason why I think our own stories and our biographies are important is that I think Janice mentioned the new story. It is a big theme that Janice often talks about, that the new story of life is beginning to emerge, and it's going to emerge not so much from the top down, that there's a hierarchy up there that tells us how things are, but it's actually going to emerge from the collective, or certainly I think we're beginning to see that today, that people are coming together, and from their collective action and gatherings, something new is emerging. So again, there's value in knowing and understanding our own stories. And also writing our stories can become something of a spiritual practice if it is done with an idea in mind. And if we actually use them to reflect upon, it can become a spiritual practice. And I think some of you may know the process of Lectio Divina, where you actually take a passage of scripture, or it can actually be widened out to some other kind of passage, and you reflect on it by looking at a small passage and allowing yourself to be drawn and sense the words that have specific meaning for you. And then you reflect on those words, whether it's a negative resonance or a positive resonance, and see what they might be saying. So we can actually look at parts of our own writing and do that kind of engage in that kind of process on our own writing. And ultimately, I think where I was saying that it's not a narcissistic navel-gazing exercise is that actually engaging with our stories, which perhaps we've only half recognized in the past, then enables us to let go of them to some extent. They don't live in us as something that's unexamined. Once they're examined and contemplated in a certain way, we're able to get a kind of, they might live in us, but we also have a kind of distance from them where we can actually use them in the next part of our life. So there are other values too, but I think I'll leave it there for today. So one of the themes that has really come out in the book is unity in diversity, and many people mention this. So I just thought I would quote two people about the outcomes at the point that at which they were writing of their journeys. And they're quite different. And I happen to know that these two people are friends. So there is deep unity in diversity here. So the first one, I can no longer look backwards at a historical Christianity, but feel called instead to listen to the summons of Christ now, in present time. Instead of joining my local church community, I feel called to be part of the many communities and small groups that have started worldwide in the last few decades and are now linking up. And that was the result of the journey for many people. And then another writer said, I continue to travel with Christianity because despite all I've learnt from the East and from more esoteric ways of thought, it still provides me with the most comprehensive and inclusive philosophy that embraces light and dark, materiality and spirituality, joy and sorrow, and gives meaning through the transforming power of love to the anguish and the pain we see all around us. And I think both these aspects have grown. There are many people that are involved in the new spirituality and contemporary movements. And we're also seeing today a return of many people to Christianity. And I think there's a book that's been written recently called The Return, or The Return to Christianity. And there are a number of notable public figures who seem to be turning back to Christianity in some way. And I think there's a seeking after the depth of some of the liturgy, particularly in the Orthodox Church, for some of these people. But beneath this, there is a unity. And I think the unity that I saw in the biographies was really in two main aspects coming out. So I've called the next slide direction of the biographies. And so there are two directions, and you can see that I'm quoting Dermot here. And one was a movement towards social justice and collaboration with others, not just within the Christian faith, but way beyond it. And this is something I've quoted to many people, and there's been deep resonance here. So he says, and maybe it's annoying to see only half a quotation from something longer, so I hope you'll forgive me. Christian discipleship today is evolving beyond the admiration for and worship of a divine patriarchal hero into a collaborative endeavor for empowering love and justice, fired by the radical vision of the new reign of God. So we may hear something more of that later. And then on the other side, from the sort of social justice, there was a movement for many people into a more mystical awareness. And I think I used this quotation earlier, but I think it can bear being read again here. The Christ mystery is indeed the way, the truth, and the life, but this is not about a religion or group one can join, which is how we have heard it, but rather a mystery of incarnation that can be experienced by all and in a million different ways. And throughout the biographies, we saw the juxtaposition of these two things, this wanting to be involved in, if you like, the healing of the world, the planet, and people. And that being empowered by a turning inwards to the mystery. For some, that would be the mystery. They would call that mystery Christ consciousness or the Christ. So I just want to finish by giving you a little teaser or taster of some of the wisdom in the biographies. And there are so many people that I could have quoted. I could have quoted something from everybody, but these two, I think, have a great way of summing up some of the themes of the biographies. So this first quotation is from someone who's sadly no longer with us, but was somebody that was quite influential. In fact, he'd been quite a leading Catholic and had actually come out of the Catholic faith and found something much broader. My spiritual journey has been full of the unexpected and seems to have come a long way so far. I share with so many others great fears for the future of the planet, and I think we're finding that more and more shared these days. Almost despair that poverty will ever be solved or that violence will ever cease. In the religious sphere, I'm disturbed by the rise of divisive religious fundamentalism, but I'm also inspired and given hope by what is unmistakably a new awareness and a new consciousness which is bursting out everywhere in different movements and networks which cross the boundaries of culture and religion in seeking unity while honouring diversity. So we're back to the unity in diversity and people becoming familiar and finding hope in that rather than running away from diversity. So the next one, we need to live as though all life is interconnected and respect the diversity as well as the unity of all life. Living as though the earth matters is vital for the future of humanity. New patterns emerge. We're back to patterns again. New patterns emerge and gather energy within the life of the world, and we need to trust them and help bring them to birth, where we discern that they are from a sacred source. And I think that sums up the journey of so many people, finding new patterns emerging in their own life as they were faithful to the new nudges of spirit in their lives. So thank you for listening, and it's great joy. I think I'm handing over to Dermot now. If I can stop my screen share. Screen share, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I was muted and couldn't unmute myself. And thank you. Firstly, thank you, Janice, Michael, and Heather Jane for inviting me to participate in this event. Congratulations on the writing of the book, and thank you, Michael, for publishing it. It will no doubt be an inspiring source for many people. Now, Michael, can I get on the share screen. Oh yeah, here we have it. I'm going to offer 2 slides, and they will I will speak to those 2 slides on my particular topic. So the word spirituality has been through a major kind of reform and reformulation over the past 50 years particularly. I offer you this quotation from Joan Chichester, who is a well-known Benedictine sister in the United States. What I find interesting about this quote is that it was written back in 1998 on the opening page of her book, Heart of Life. She says, there is a new question in the spiritual life. It is the spirituality of the spiritual life itself. Life here and the way we relate to it, rather than life to come and how we can guarantee it for ourselves, has become the spiritual conundrum of our age. Now, she's talking about 2 ways of understanding spirituality. So the first is focused around the word escape. And this is the more traditional understanding. Escape from this veil of tears to the promise of salvation in a world beyond. And then the second word, which is the one that's more relevant for our time and has already been addressed by the previous speakers, is the call to engage, a form of engagement that involves embracing afresh our place in God's creation and rediscovering the meaning of what we call God in that wider and deeper context. And then for the sake of clarification, I would call the former approach the spiritual life, and this new approach, let's use the word spirituality for it. Now, the 2 positions then I want to talk about briefly in terms of these 2 diagrams. So the diagram on the left is the one, I guess, that many of us were probably brought up with or introduced to in our earlier life, that the spirituality or the spiritual journey is about a relationship between me and God, represented with a direct line on the triangle. And so in theory, this relationship is possible and indeed desirable from God's point of view and from the point of view of the spiritual seeker. But in the traditional paradigm, you can only manage that journey if you have the support of the church, which is the bottom left-hand corner, and a particular structure called a prayer life. Now, in the case of the church, in the non-Catholic context, that's a deeper immersion in Scripture. That's what that basically means. In the Catholic context, it's about more frequenting the sacramental system of the church. And so a lot of Catholics, in going to Eucharist, for example, talk about going to church on Sunday. Prayer life here has a very formal meaning. It's about saying or doing the prayers prescribed for us and to us by the doctrines about the teaching of the church. And so that's in a very brief synopsis, the earlier understanding. Now, what we need to note here is that this understanding is focused completely on and exclusively on human beings only, and more particularly on that dimension of the human person that we call the soul. And therefore, the salvation of the soul is the goal of this approach to the spiritual life. And the God understood here is the God above the sky, the ruling patriarchal God, God the Father, mediated for us in and through the life of Jesus. But again, Jesus understood very much in those kind of imperial terms. Now, that model is kind of running its course. And indeed, for a lot of people, including the biographers that Jane spoke so beautifully about, this paradigm has run its course. It's no longer experienced as being nourishing or meaningful or sustaining. And so the biographers in various ways are being called and allured to the diagram on the right. Now, firstly, you will notice in the diagram on the right that all the images, all the circles are open. Everything on the left is closed. We're dealing with closed systems. Secondly, everything on the right is interconnected. Whereas on the left, me is me, God is God, church is church, prayer life is prayer life. And they have their own respective spaces and identities. And then the movement on the left is basically between God and me with the support of the church and the prayer life. The movement on the right is multi-directional, which initially will look very baffling and confusing. Now, to explain the numbers, which I then do with the notes underneath. So the largest of the circles on the right is the cosmic horizon, where God begins in time. So what I'm suggesting here, that in the paradigm shift to this newer way of understanding spirituality, we do not begin with God, and we do not begin with the human being, and we do not begin with the church, nor with prayer life. We begin with the story of creation in its largest possible horizons. Why begin there? And the answer is fairly simple, but would take a lot of unraveling, which we won't be doing on this occasion, because that's where God begins in time. Our God has been manifesting God's self to us for billions of years in and through the miracle of creation. And all that was going on long before religions, churches, or religious institutions or doctrines were ever heard of. The second major circle is the Earth horizon. And it's in and through this horizon that we begin to engage with the underlying mystery, which today we would call the mystery of God's Holy Spirit, because the Spirit is what energizes everything in creation. Now, the other term that you will be hearing in this context are people being described as earthlings. That's being used even in some church documents from various Christian churches over the past 10 to 15 years particularly. Then the number 3, the third circle in, is all the other life forms with whom we share the web of life, including the animals, the trees, the plants, and right down to the bacteria. Now, my diagram gets a little bit complicated, but fits in so beautifully with what Michael was talking about, what Heather was talking about, and what Janice referred to. And that's the whole idea of patterns. So the 3 number 4s, I describe in my notes there as the relational matrix for all spiritual becoming, or what one American scholar, coming from a systems theory background, calls the patterning instinct. That everything in creation is fundamentally programmed for patterning, for relationship, for interconnection. These words, you've heard them many times from the previous speakers already tonight. Now, in doctrinal terms, then, this is what we're what the Christian churches call the Trinity. But of course, we have made that incredibly complicated because we were using the metaphysics coming from Greek philosophy, trying to figure out how do you put the 3 into 1, when in fact it has nothing at all really to do with that. The doctrine of the Trinity is a human attempt to explain that whatever else this reality we call God is about, whatever else God is about, it's about a deep capacity for relating. A deep capacity for relating. A relating that happens within that context of the oneness that all the great mystics talk about, but a oneness that embraces great diversity. So these number 4s then in my diagram, they're stretching right across the entire diagram because they're operative at every level of creation, from the physical to the psychological to the psychic and so forth. And then finally, we come to number 5 there in the center. And this is human beings in the web of belonging. Now, one of the major challenges about this approach to spirituality is that the understanding of the human person on the left and the understanding of the human person here on the right is a totally different reality. The one on the left is the traditional Greek metaphysical approach. It's the isolated, autonomous me, standing before an isolated, autonomous God, if you like. The human being on the right is the one that belongs, whose identity is taken from the web of belonging. One of the definitions here used by some anthropologists, including people like Carol Young, that Michael referred to earlier on, I am at all times the sum of my relationships. And that's what confers and gives me identity. I am at all times the sum of my relationships, and that's what confers or gives me identity. So that's one of the major challenges of this new approach to spirituality, is a whole redefining of what it means to be human. And that it's the connectedness, the patterning that's at the heart of our identity, but indeed also at the heart of every other identity across the entire web of creation. Now, some people are very quick then to retort and remind me that I don't mention the word God at all, or at least God is not mentioned explicitly in this diagram on the right. And there's no need to, because if you like, the energizing force of the entire interactive approach here is what we call God. But of course, our traditional understandings of God don't then make much sense in this particular diagram. And so what the emphasis here shifts significantly from the creator God, who creates from outside, to the inspirited, inspiring God who operates from within. And for me, at least, the people are the dimensions of our contemporary culture that explain that probably most clearly are our indigenous peoples around the world, many of whom are still using the notion of God as the Great Spirit, the Great Spirit. But for them, the Great Spirit is not some kind of an autonomous human-like being outside the world. It's that creative transpersonal energy at work within creation. And for our indigenous peoples, we connect with that primarily in and through the land, in and through the soil. That may sound somewhat materialistic, but actually on a careful reading of the great mystics, you'll find that we're all closely affiliated with that sense of perceiving and connecting the sacred one in and through creation. So that's the shift that we're looking at. And I have offered these insights, or this brief input tonight, because I do think that many of the biographers that are at the heart of this book and the reflection around their great stories are on this journey. And I hope they'll be blessed and guided to take it to its full length, for whatever that might mean for each one of them. So at this stage, I'm stopping and I'm handing it back now to Michael to open up the dialogue with the participants.
Thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, this is a great time to ask, and hopefully we can answer in the best way possible. I can always share my screen again to have a background. There we go.
Well, I'm wondering how many of the people who've kindly joined us tonight feel recognition within themselves that what we've been sharing. I wonder, Barbara, I think you're on the line. You're quite good at being the first one to come forward. How about you respond?
Well, yes, I do resonate very much with everything that's been said. Thank you very much. And I can't wait to read the book, really.
Any other questions or ideas?
I have a question, if I'm allowed.
Mhm.
And that is, Dermot, you were talking about our new sense of identity, and it's very much the sum total, if you like, of our relationships and our connectedness, perhaps, with all that is. Do you see that there's something core and fundamental also within that that's perhaps in a way beyond all of that?
I guess the short answer would be yes, but I think whatever that core is, we're not going to come to it in the more traditional individual way of approaching it. That the realization of that core dimension and the integration of it into our hearts. Now, I forgot to mention, of course, in contemporary spirituality, the word integration is emerging as the big word. And so I think the core is about the integration, whereas in the diagram, my diagram on the left, the core was what they call the soul. A lot of people don't seem to be aware of the fact that the notion of soul was actually introduced into the Christian language and into the Christian concepts by Aristotle primarily. And Aristotle lived only a few hundred years before the time of Jesus. As a human species, we have been on this earth and have been relating and behaving spiritually for thousands upon thousands of years. And I think we've been doing that more as creatures of spirit rather than creatures of soul. So the core in the earlier understanding would have been the soul. I think the core now for our time is that energizing spirit that draws everything into a new sense, potentially into a new sense of harmony.
Can I get Judy ask a question? So they kindly raise their hand. So I think you should receive a message. There we go.
Thank you. Could you allow us all to unmute ourselves so that we can join in the discussion? I just want to say how very grateful I am to have travelled with the people who belong to Cana for the last 24 years. Because before that I was just struggling. I never found anyone who thought in the same sort of way as myself, who wanted to think outside the accepted Christian box. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
And thank you for your contribution over the years and all the wisdom that you've brought and that wonderfully gentle spirit.
So you should be able to unmute yourselves now, but if it doesn't work, just let me know. But if anyone else has any other questions or would like to say something, please do.
Carol wants to come in, I think. If I'm pronouncing it. Yes.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Well, there we go.
Thank you very much, all of you. I was particularly loved the phrase embodied heart from Heather, and regarding a knowing or a certainty. And I'm just wondering if that's what really is a place of rest in oneself and therefore in Christ. It's kind of a resting. It's a being, a knowing of oneself in Christ. Don't know whether that makes sense or not.
Well, it certainly makes sense to me. I think that it is a place of rest. And I've often thought about when I was growing up as an evangelical Christian, there was something that they would talk about as resting in God.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's probably akin to some of the experience that we can experience in meditation or in mystical experiences. And so I think that word rest is quite important because we are in a very restless world. And the fact is that when you come to this kind of knowing, there's a deep sense of rest about it. But there's also another R, which is about return. I certainly haven't reached a place where I'm in that place of rest all the time, but I know it's there. And actually, I need the practices which enable me to get back to that place of rest. which is also a place of love, I would say.
Yes, thank you. I think it's what the Bible calls an abiding.
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
And how badly our world needs that right now, because if you listen to the news, it can be quite fearful, can't it? But if we can rest in a deeper knowing that all will be well, all manner of things will be well, that really is very reassuring.
Yeah.
I think there's also been quite a lot of talk in recent years about contemplation and social action and needing both, because it is from that place of contemplation, rest and love, and renewing ourselves in that place of nurture and love, that we can make the best contribution to the world. I think one of the biographies, one that I quoted, talked about contributing to the world when you're led and you know it's coming from a sacred source. And I think that sacred source is one that does connect us with that sense of nurture and rest and love.
I'd also like to add this is Carol. I'd like to very much add my thanks to this evening, and I'm really deeply moved, and it's very much my spiritual journey, what has been expressed, and the symbolism for me at the moment. I'd like to read it all again, but what Diarmuid said, and the first diagram and then the second is very much my experience, and also what we hear. And it's just about weekly I hear the word integration through the radio and other. It's just really moving and exciting, really, for me. So thank you I know how much that book has been in exploration and thought and time and effort. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think worth adding maybe here to integration and contemplation, to put those two words together.
Yes.
And there's a beautiful definition of contemplation from the famous American monk, Thomas Merton. He says, contemplation is the keen awareness of the interdependence of all things under God. So the keen awareness that it's a deeper, restful, more integrated awareness of the interdependence of all things under God. So in that sense, contemplation doesn't take us away from the world, which was the old dualistic understanding, to go away and lock yourself in a monastery or something. The truly integrated contemplative outlook invites us to become more immersed in the heart of God's world. And hopefully there be a force for that restful integration and peacemaking, which is so desperately needed in our time.
Yeah, maybe you could say we're called to be mystics in the marketplace, not in the monastery.
Right.
I like that.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
But we do need companions on the way to encourage
Yeah,
us.
we do. You're so right, Judy. We need
Yes.
companions on the way.
Linda wants to come in. You need to unmute yourself.
Should be able to.
Yes.
There we go.
Have I done it? Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, jolly good. Thank you. The evening is very nourishing, and there's a question brewing in me, which is about the feelings that the right-hand side image that Diarmuid shared evokes. I'm wondering if each of the speakers might just talk into how to help give people permission to move from left to right, or do you think it just happens naturally? And how to really nurture that journey of integration to become the people that we can become rather than the constraints of the old model. Does that make sense?
A spiritual companion or a soulmate will certainly be helpful. And unfortunately, nowadays, you know, you can go online, whatever country you're in, particularly in the Western world, and just put in the word spiritual direction or spiritual accompaniment, and you'll get a list of people that have done some training and facilitation in that. And they can certainly be of help. But also, I think a close, trusted friend can be immensely helpful here, because it's all about, as other speakers have said, it's about love and friendship. But the other factor I would want to add, which is one of my hobby horses, it's also about invoking the adult in oneself and trusting your adult wisdom in helping to make that journey across. Those would be my few additional comments on it.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yes, I think mine would be to emphasize the companionship. I mentioned Ursula Burton, with whom I wrote several books, and it was an absolute relief to meet her in the 1970s. And when we published our first book, which we called Christian Evolution, Moving Towards a Global Spirituality, that was in 1984, the letters that we received more or less all said the same thing. When I read your book, a great sense of relief flowed over me that I wasn't going mad after all. So when someone is coming out from the sort of popular norms, as it were, it can be very lonely. And so to know others are there and to have someone you can share it with, I think is so important. One other will be quite enough. We don't need a whole group, although a group is lovely as well.
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
carry on. Did you want to?
No, I wanted to contribute to what's just been said. Is that okay, Heather?
Oh,
yes. First of all, Linda, and it may be that's who Diarmuid is responding to when he says to look on the internet and the words. But actually, William Bloom offers, and his organization offer a course, Spiritual Companioning. And that isn't just for people who can afford to then contribute financially, but that's exactly what I think you're asking for. You know, at least you could try looking at the website. You know, in fact, they're just offering to put on another course, and I have actually done it, and it was enormously helpful. And actually, my background is coming from that I didn't realize at the age of 35 that I had my own inner, or could find my own inner knowing, because I relied too much on the Christian strong leadership as being able to totally guide me and decide for me. And so that's been a process of then moving to the second diagram that Diarmuid, and I visualized well that diagram, what you mentioned, Diarmuid O'Murchu. So thank you. Yeah.
I think what's coming to my mind is a tension between sowing seeds and being a millstone round people's necks. And if you destroy somebody's faith, then it's like putting a millstone round their neck. But what I have found is that when I'm brave to, and I don't make assumptions now that people aren't thinking this way. And in fact, I'm finding more and more people are thinking in this way. So if I'm brave just to share something kind of myself or my own experience, I actually find a great resonance in people I would never have expected. I remember talking to, meeting for the first time in centuries, it seems, at a funeral, somebody who had been a neighbour of mine when I was a child, and he was a window cleaner. And just because of the way that we were able to talk, perhaps because we'd had that bond of living in the same street as a child, he opened up about his spiritual experiences. And it was a sort of person that you may not have thought would have had them. He didn't go to church. He wasn't part of a new spiritual movement. There are many people out there that are not part of any of all of this who actually have a deep spirituality. And I don't mean it was because he was a window cleaner, because actually I find people like that, and particularly gardeners, have a very deep spirituality often. And I found it in plumbers and carpenters and all sorts of people. And I think perhaps there's something about those trades and actually working with the hands that actually does open up a kind of spirituality, but they wouldn't use the same words that we do. So an openness to the fact that actually it's already there. And also, I think the fact that there's so much despair in the world now, I'm seeing more and more people who want to be able to do something. And actually, if you can hand something to people that can enable them to feel a bit empowered, that also opens up a kind of conversation and a bridge into all of this.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think what I would add is the idea that it's coming from where the person is, rather than necessarily where you're seeing yourself from. And that something so subtle could be a call to adventure, as I looked at the hero's journey, and that it's trying to find these underlying values, almost like love and connection and beauty, that everyone understands. And these can be pebble stones to the divine in a way. These can be reminders of what connects us, rather than seeing someone as coming from a different point of view.
Linda, what would you say? Because you're somebody that brings beautiful connection to so many people, partly through your art.
Well, I think each of you have, can you hear me? Because I can't
Mhm.
see me at all on this.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I think each of you have sort of, it's like a kaleidoscope. You've each said beautiful things and helped me. I guess that for me, there's a sense of what would it be? I fear for the church and people having no alternative and not realizing actually that there's a much bigger, wonderful way of being, and just in my own little corner of the world, wondering how could I be someone who, I mean, I've had a spiritual director for very many years, and use art and do workshops and things, but I feel I've got to the stage where I can't belong to the established church, and wept buckets about it, just thinking, gosh, a great fear of losing my faith, because it's been the one solid thread. And yet some of the speakers have sort of said, yes, it's a lonely place, but having been taken through that, coming to a bigger sense of belonging and noticing the divine in very many ways. And I suppose I'm just wondering, okay, I've had a journey, and then how do I use my journey? A big theme for me is I don't want to be doing anymore. I want to be being. And people look at me as if I'm mad, but I've spent a lifetime of doing, overdoing, overcaring. And just I want to be able to get to the end of my life and say that was great. And I think part of that for me is spending time just being me as a creature in the world, with my beautiful allotment and my looking after hedgehogs that need care for a while, and responding to friends who perhaps are dying or whatever, being able to respond in a way that I wouldn't have done in the last 20 years, where I've led all sorts of art workshops and meditation groups. I'm really moving away from that. And so I don't know quite where I am. And that's a very odd well, I've almost given you my story. There we are. I can put my story alongside everybody else's, and that's where I am. And I'm the happiest I've been in the whole of my life.
Oh,
So that's what I bring to the table. And I don't know how.
Linda. Well, you're describing
you.
someone in transition, and I think we're all in transition. The world's in transition. So thank you.
Do we have any final thoughts or questions before?
Michael, there is a question on the chat box from
Oh, is
Bridget Hewitt, which in a sense I think Linda has already partly responded to. She asks, what about the church? The churches seem to kind of not be keeping up with all this. I think it's worth keeping in mind here that the fundamental meaning of church is the creation of meaningful faith community. But unfortunately, the kind of what we call the institution took over the centuries and sidelined the whole notion of community. And I think increasingly, and that's what the diagram on the right is about, this sense of community, it's not just about other human beings, it's also about including the wider creation, whether it's caring for the animals or whatever it might be that Linda referred to. But I think the big challenge facing church, with a big C or a small c for all of us nowadays, is about finding and fostering some meaningful sense of community. For some of us, that might be just 2 or 3 other people, or it might be with some animals, or it might be with our garden. But yeah, there is a major challenge here for church in the traditional sense. But I think as a way forward, again, back to that integration, can we begin to explore and even think through new ways of being church in terms of building meaningful community?
That's a nice note to end on, Dermot. Thank you. Shall we
Janice?
close with a little blessing?
Yeah.
Mother Jane, you suggested we read the piece on building bridges. Would you like to read that, or shall I do it?
Oh, would you like to do it? Because I don't have it here now, unfortunately. I would love to have read it because I think it's very important.
This is a little piece which is in the book, if you have the book. I just give a little explanation. I was driving to work along the motorway. I lived quite a long way from the Open University where I worked. And I was just coming up the slip road off the motorway when suddenly it was like, whee, something came through. And I had to pull in onto the hard shoulder. I just grabbed a pen and I wrote it. And this is what it was. And I think it's a lovely little piece. So I'll read it quite slowly. What is it to be a bridge builder to the new? It is to live in the full awareness of every moment as a divine droplet of potentiality in the ocean of eternity. It is to see every person as carrying the Christ light within them, and every situation as an opportunity for releasing a little more of the shadows that keep that light from shining. It is to listen innerly at all times and all places for the next step ahead. It is trusting each step to reveal itself to us, knowing that every need will be perfectly met. It is embracing with loving arms those that appear to stand in the way of our purpose, as well as those who do not seem to understand. It is knowing that where 2 or 3 are gathered, the I am presence is there in the midst. It is embracing within our being the whole universe, knowing that at one and the same time, each of us is nothing and each of us is everything. I think if we just pause for a moment and thank life, thank God, thank the whole beauty of this universe, that we are just small and nothing, and we are one with the whole. We are everything. So it's been a nourishing evening. Thank you, Mikhail, for hosting us and for publishing the book. And thank you for everyone who's contributed. It's been companionship, really and truly, hasn't it? Did you want to finish with anything, Heather Jane?
No, I think that's fine. Thank you to all that were here, and huge thanks to all the biographers who shared very generously their stories. They are like a kind of gentle dynamite and worthy of study.
That's right. Well, thank you. And good night, everyone, and thank you. Thank you to everyone. We are all part of this collective unfolding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Ozanne,
Bye.
I will
Thank you.
end.